Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and welcome to another lecture in our initial tour and lecture series on the 7 Days campaign, which was conducted in October of 1994. If you have seen any of the other tapes in this series, you'll realize that this particular version is best watched after having watched the lecture by Mike Andrus, which was about 38 minutes. This one runs a bit longer, about an hour, and it runs from the White Oak Swamp engagement through the withdrawal to Harrison Landing following the Battle of Malvern Hill. Mike Litterst is a man who you might recognize. He's fairly well recognized now as the spokesperson for the National Park Service, and he is frequently seen giving interviews and commentary on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. I knew Mike, and when I introduced him to this, Mike was a neighbor of mine in Spotsylvania, Virginia, and he was working as a historian also at Richmond National Battlefield. And as you'll see from looking at him, he was a mighty young character in those days. Mike had initially worked with us and had agreed to write the very first scholarly monograph in our series, which now numbers 20 such publications. He wrote the monograph, He Came as a Peacemaker, Abraham Lincoln in Richmond After the Fall of Richmond. It is a wonderful work, and Mike is a very talented historian who loves battlefields and loves presenting battlefields. He's an engaging personality. Join me and enjoy him in his early days of the National Park Service. Please join me in welcoming Mike Litterst.
Regards to the 7 days and the performance of the commanders are the ones which might feed into me during that time period. So we find that our things will tend to mesh together and flow very well. One of the most important things that Mike touched on that I want to pick up is the fact that, well, the 7 days has been written about and touched on perhaps lightly in the past year. It is generally, when it is referred to, either done so as one large campaign, beginning on June 25th and ending on July 1st, 1862, or it's considered as 6 separate engagements, starting with the engagement at King's Schoolhouse and concluding with the titanic struggle on the slopes of Malvern Hill a week later. As Mike pointed out, as I want to pick up on, I think the 7 days is best considered as 2 distinct phases of one much larger campaign. The first phase, which Mike touched on, deals with the offensive movement made by Robert E. Lee in an attempt to relieve pressure against Richmond. And that having been accomplished, the second phase begins with his attempt at a pursuit and an attempt to destroy the Army of the Potomac that had been for Richmond. It is in that vein which I will attempt to finish off the 7 days that Mike has started. By the night of June 27th, 28th, as Mike alluded, the first phase had ended. The Army of the Potomac was now changing its base, as their commander was going to refer to it, and Lee would now try and seize upon this opportunity to finish off the job. There was to be no time for Robert E. Lee to rest on his laurels, beginning on the 28th. Almost immediately, he began to look for a way in which to increase this great success which he had achieved for the Confederacy. Lee had been in command of the Army of Northern Virginia for less than a month as the sun rose on June 28th. Again, already, he had achieved for the Confederacy arguably one of its greatest strategic victories. He began to hastily map out a plan of pursuit, and while mapping out that pursuit, his attention fell to a small crossroads known as Glendale, located about 12 miles southeast of Richmond. And it was with this aggressive pursuit, Lee strategized, that he would be able to close in on the Federal Army as it fled through Glendale. It would, by Lee's estimate, take 24 hours or so to get all of the various elements in motion that morning. And as such, Lee would buy time with the rearguard action that took place at Savage Station. In the bungled affair at Savage Station, the Federals handily turned back. The Confederate attempts of assault continued their movement southward towards the James River. By the morning of June 30th, though, Lee's strategic plan was beginning to unfold as he had scheduled. That morning, no less than 5 columns of Confederate infantry were converging on the Army of the Potomac at the Glendale Crossroads. Passed out a couple maps. You should find them under the one that Mike gave you and the one that Mike had you refer to. And on the bottom of the first one, you see Glendale. And you can see there what an important strategic location Glendale was for the Confederacy that day. At Glendale, a number of roads came together. And as we see so often throughout the war, anytime you have a convergence of roads, it is there that you can most easily bring your forces together. It's there that you can concentrate on a foe. Also at Glendale, related to the road, the Union retreat route was falling down from 2 roads that they had used through White Oak Swamp. And at Glendale, they would be forced to funnel down to a single narrow lane. So Lee now had the added advantage that he was pursuing a Federal Army, which was bottlenecked at the Glendale Crossroads. So seemingly, Lee had laid the perfect trap on the morning of June 30th. And as you see on your map, the various forces which he had converging ran from his left to his right. And on the far Confederate left, you had Stonewall Jackson, seemingly plagued by lethargy in the early days of the campaign. But to Jackson, along with the divisions of Chase Whiting and D.H. Hill, this force would be continuing their advance from Savage Station to White Oak Swamp. The force crossing at the swamp would converge on the rear of the Union Army around Glendale. Jackson that morning had 4 divisions, totaling some 25,000 men. To Jackson's right, the division of Benjamin Huger would pursue down the Charles City Road. And Huger was one of 2 columns that day who was converging directly on the crossroads. Huger had about 12,000 men at his disposal, and he would form the key to the Confederate advance that day. He had the shortest march, about 3 miles. By that, he would open the battle. To the right of Huger and in the center of the Confederate lines, James Longstreet and A.P. Hill, they had been marching hard to try and get in a position to attack Glendale. They'd been marching down the Darbytown Road. You see the map above for Savage Station. While the action at Savage Station was occurring on the 29th, you see on the left of your map A.P. Hill and Longstreet making that sort of end run down the Darbytown Road. Morning of the 30th, their march would continue down the Darbytown Road to the Longbridge Road, which funneled directly into the crossroads. Longstreet and Hill had between them almost 20,000 men. They again were spearheading one of the 2 columns directly into the crossroads. John Bankhead Magruder that day would occupy a position of reserve. He would be floating in the rear along the Darbytown Road with 13,000 men. And holding the far Confederate right, see the bottom of the map there, was Theophilus Holmes with a small division, 7,200 men, 6 batteries of artillery, and they would hopefully be advancing down the New Market Road, threatening the Federals as they marched hard to the James River. So in all, Lee had over 77,000 men converging on the Glendale Crossroads that morning. And despite the overall numerical superiority of his foe, on the field that day, Lee actually outnumbered his opponent by some 10,000 men. Additionally, to the Confederate benefit, McClellan was continuing his penchant for not being present when the fighting actually began. The contest for the crossroads began that morning. McClellan would be some 5 miles away, safely squired aboard a Federal gunboat in the James River. The fate of the Army of the Potomac lay not in the hands of their commander that morning, but rather in those of Robert E. Lee and his lieutenants. The sun rose on June 30th. Lee was advancing in superior numbers against a leaderless, demoralized, and bottlenecked foe. As Porter Alexander would later recall, it was to be the opportunity of his life. As the action began early that morning on the Confederate left, things did not begin with a great deal of optimism, at least from part of the Confederates. Jackson, spearheading the command that would pursue down from Savage Station, the hero of First Manassas and the Valley Campaign had a fitful night's sleep, to be sure. A hard rain fell in the region on the night of the 29th and the 30th. Jackson was soaked so he actually abandoned his bivouac and sought the shelter of a nearby wagon. So hard had the rain been and so thoroughly soaked was the mighty Stonewall that he, by 1 o'clock in the morning, he had given up completely on an attempt to get a good night's sleep. For a man whose performance in the campaign to this point indicated a desperate need for a good night's rest, this was certainly an ominous beginning for the day for the Confederates. However, by dawn, Jackson seemed to have reverted to his old self. It seemed that his interrupted night's sleep had not cost him significantly. Lee and Jackson met early that morning in the vicinity of Savage Station to try and map out the day's strategy. And again, it appeared that Jackson in that meeting had shaken off the lethargy that had gripped him so. Jackson had his men marching before dawn. They would be crossing the recently rebuilt Grapevine Bridge that had slowed him so the day before, and advancing on the Federal rear guard. An observer between the meeting of Jackson and Lee noted that Jackson was even animatedly drawing a sketch in the dirt with the toe of his boot, and emphatically punctuating it with the stamp of his boot and a cry of, "Now we've got him." Apparently it was to be a long day for McClellan, if Stonewall Jackson was going to have anything to say about it. Jackson quickly found the going slow that morning as he attempted to pursue the Federal rear guard. He found a constant stream of stragglers from the Union Army that he was forced to devote time and energy to scooping up. 2,500 Federals alone were captured at a hospital near Savage Station. And as they continued their march, Jackson was forced to detail a regiment merely to deal with the scores and hundreds of Federal stragglers that his column continued to scoop up. But by noon, Jackson, his 4 divisions, had managed to march their way to the now smoldering remains of the bridge across the White Oak Swamp. And on the far side, they could see 2 divisions of Federal infantry who had just before crossed and set fire to the bridge. Jackson quickly set out to deploy his own forces. Federals were shelling them with artillery. Jackson quickly set out to deploy his own artillery. Soon he seemed to be the Jackson mold, with 28 guns deployed and pelting the Federals with, as one bluecoat called it, a perfect shower of missiles. Jackson also aggressively forced a crossing of the stream, went over with some of D.H. Hill's skirmishers to scout Federal positions, although he was shortly driven back across by the hot fire that was coming from the Federal position. And that fire was also creating difficulty for his men as they attempted to rebuild the White Oak Swamp Bridge. It was this bridge that the column would need to cross, and the Federals were making it difficult indeed to get any sort of work going to rebuild that bridge. Yet here's Stonewall Jackson, who seemingly began to slip back into the torpor that had placed himself for the past several days. As his men struggled with the fire and struggled to get some sort of bridge up across the swamp, Jackson did precious little to give them any assistance. At about 3 o'clock, while the opposing batteries battled back and forth and his men had given up the attempt to rebuild the bridge, Jackson himself sat down beneath a tree and went to sleep. He woke about an hour later, found time to write a letter to his wife, recommended she send $50 to the church. Meanwhile, his men chafed on the north side of the White Oak Swamp. Not only did Jackson seem disinterested in scouting possible crossing points, but likewise, he did not even react as various suggestions were brought to him about what the Confederate column might do. One of his cavalry officers discovered a small cattle ford just upstream and said that the Confederates could certainly force a crossing there. Wade Hampton reported back to Jackson that a crude pole bridge that the general had requested be built downstream was now complete. However, Jackson listened dispassionately to both reports, making a reply to neither one of his officers. Once again, for the 4th time in 5 days, the Army of Northern Virginia rolled into battle. Jackson and his force would be conspicuously absent. They remained curiously stationary as the fighting began to rage, certainly within the earshot. Despite the fact that to this point in the day, Jackson had suffered but 3 killed and 12 wounded. The day was over for Stonewall Jackson and those 4 divisions of Confederate infantry. They were seemingly, once again, a victim of the exhaustion that was plaguing their command. On Jackson's right, the division of Benjamin Huger, mentioned earlier, was one of two columns who was aimed directly at the crossroads. They held, for the most part, the central portion in Lee's line. They had the shortest march of the day at 3 miles. And by way of those two facts, the day's entire attack would hinge on Huger and his division. Upon encountering the Federals, Huger was to open with his artillery. That was to be the signal to the rest of the army that the assault was to begin. That the day's events hung so heavily over Huger was a product merely by his position of march, not that as much that Lee had seen any great tactical or strategic skills in his rather girthsome lieutenant. By assigning the important tasks of the day merely on the basis of a geographic location, Lee was assuming that there was an approximate equality of skill among his various lieutenants. Quite simply did not exist within the Army of Northern Virginia during their inaugural campaign. Certainly in future battles, after Lee had restructured the Army of Northern Virginia and made it truly his own, this would be a valid conclusion for the most part. But operating on this final day of June with 4 separate commands, who this far had shown their talents and skills were widely varied, such an assumption would prove to be costly indeed. By noon, Huger's men had made about a mile on their march, and they were within 2 miles of the crossroads at Glendale. At this point, they began to run into a little bit of interference. The lead brigade that day, under the command of William Mahone, his van came across some obstructions which had been felled across the Charles City Road, designed merely to slow down any pursuit by the Confederate troops. Now, like Huger being the hinge for the Confederate attack that day, Mahone as well led the division merely because of his position in the line of march. Additionally, because of the somewhat convoluted system of Confederate rank, Mahone was actually a senior brigade commander over 2 of his fellow brigadiers who had attended West Point, Lewis Armistead and Mervyn Wright. In any event, the felled trees and obstructions that day that Mahone encountered seemed to have awakened an engineer in him. Or rather than merely dispatching troops under a covering fire to remove the obstructions, Mahone sent for the division pioneers and had them begin to carve a new road through the woods parallel to the Charles City Road. Well, the Federals, for their part, seeing the object of the Confederate efforts, merely redoubled their own efforts and continued to fell trees and obstructions further along down the Charles City Road. This, of course, lengthened the distance that the pioneers had to clear. The more Mahone attempted to clear the Charles City Road, the longer the Federals continued to obstruct it with fallen logs. And throughout the afternoon, sounds of ringing axes biting into wood sang throughout the forest around Glendale, while Mahone's men completed 1 mile of new road through the woods. At some point in this rather bizarre battle of the axes, Benjamin Huger himself rode up to see what was causing the delay. And he apparently approved, or at the very least did not find anything peculiar about Mahone's efforts that afternoon. For Huger would later note only that for such work, we were deficient in tools. Having been chastised for his performance during the Battle of Seven Pines a month earlier, Huger was not again going to leave himself open to charges of recklessness. Rather than now acting boldly in an attempt to redeem himself, Huger was content merely to act cautiously to avoid further blame. Well, by 2 o'clock, Mahone's lumberjacks had finally managed to outswing their Federal counterparts, and though victorious in this rather odd skirmish, Mahone, and by extension all of Huger's division, lost 2 precious hours of time. Additionally, as they began to move forward, they quickly encountered a much larger, much more daunting obstacle. Across the road, on a rise in front of them, was the division of Henry Warner Slocum and his artillery, to which Huger deployed in line of battle. Huger ordered up his artillery, and at 2:30 opened fire on the Federals to his front. Not surprisingly, Slocum's men answered in kind, and like Jackson before him, after suffering only a few casualties, Mahone's men pulled back to the cover of some woods, contented themselves with an artillery duel. Despite outnumbering the Federals to their front by a ratio of 3 to 2, Jay never ordered nor attempted an assault that day that would open the road into the Glendale crossroads. Having spent their energy early that afternoon merely attempting to reinvent the wheel, the Holmes Brigade, Jay's entire division, spent the remainder of the afternoon contended with a long-range artillery duel. Meanwhile, as ordered, the divisions of Longstreet and A.P. Hill waited to commit their troops until they got some indication from Jay's column that the assault was well underway. An indication, of course, that would never come. Inexplicably to Robert E. Lee, the attack and pursuit on the left of his line had miscarried very badly. He soon discovered that affairs were really not in any better shape off on his right. On the far right of Lee's line that day was the division of Theophilus Holmes, again some 7,200 men, 6 batteries of artillery. Admittedly, little was expected of Holmes and his men that day. The 57-year-old Major General was practically deaf, considered by many to be a has-been, and his troops were simply too green. They had recently arrived from a rather quiet sector in North Carolina. Lee hoped, however, that a situation might present itself that day, whereby at least Holmes might be able to bring his artillery to bear on the fleeing wagon train of the Union Army. Such an opportunity did indeed present itself at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Holmes received words from some Confederate cavalry. Federal wagons were streaming up Malvern Hill on their way to the James River. They were streaming by a position that was no more than 800 yards from his own position. Holmes sort of frittered about, hemming and hawing over what to do, until finally a visit by Lee himself prodded Holmes into action. Holmes brought up initially 6 pieces of artillery, some infantry to support it. No sooner had they reached their position, a storm of shot and shell began to rain around the green Confederate troops. The man had been betrayed by the cloud of dust that they had kicked up on their march to the position. Adding to the confusion and terror of the falling the shells were the Federal gunboats in the James River. They were now within range of the Confederate lines, and they proceeded to add a stream of 100-pound shells to some of the Confederate wags referred to that day as lampposts. Now, while most of Holmes' raw troops panicked, the general himself remained the calm center amid a swirling storm. Perhaps it would have benefited his men if they'd been as deaf as their commander was that afternoon. They might not have been so easily rattled by the maelstrom. At the height of it all, old General Holmes poked his head out of the house that he had taken position in, cupped his right ear, and said, "I thought I heard some firing." In any event, shortly thereafter, Holmes pulled back his infantry, his decimated artillery. Like Jackson and Huger before him, Theophilus Holmes was finished for the day. Lee's assault column of 4 converging forces had now fallen by the wayside. With the failings of his other 3 commanders, Longstreet and A.P. Hill, and all their almost 20,000 men, were all that remained of an attack force that should have numbered almost 80,000 men. To complete the tragedy, Lee somehow now felt compelled to order these 2 divisions to attack, somehow hoping that the sound of battle would jolt his languishing lieutenants back to life. And around 5 o'clock, the battle lines of Longstreet and Hill splashed across the swampy ground and moved uphill towards the Glendale crossroads. For several hours that evening in the dying daylight, they fought heroically, while the anticipated support on their left never materialized. They were, however, fortuitous, not only in the fact that McClellan, in his absence, had failed to appoint a field commander, causing some confusion on the field for the Union troops that day, but they also struck the part of his line held by the battle-weary Pennsylvania Reserve Division of George McCall. The Pennsylvania Reserves also bearing the brunt of the fighting at Beaver Dam Creek and Gaines Mill just a few days earlier. As night fell, the fighting finally, mercifully, sputtered to a close. For all of his careful planning and effort, Lee had gained but a few acres of ground around the crossroads and some captured Federal guns. But the price he had paid was very high indeed. On day 6, the Army of Northern Virginia lost another 3,300 men. His Federal counterparts just under 2,900. And so as the firing died away in with the daylight on June 30th, 1862, and undoubtedly frustrated, Robert E. Lee must have gone to bed wondering what on earth had gone wrong. His perfectly laid trap and his quarry had slipped from his fingers. For the fourth time in 5 days, the execution of a generally sound battle plan was found lacking. The Federals were allowed to escape. Certainly the day's plan had presented some sort of challenge to the Army of Northern Virginia. The convergence of 4 columns on a field of battle is no easy task. However, each column was already on the field as the day began. They were in communication with one another, and neither column had to cross a road occupied by another. The advance would not have been as difficult as some others that had preceded and would succeed the Army. Additionally, unlike the situation in Mechanicsville, there was to be no one arriving on the field mid-battle and sending the signal off to the other. So the failure of Lee to exercise tactical control of the situation and his lieutenants had certainly played a major role. Also, the inadequacies of staff that had plagued the Army throughout the early portion of the campaign, as well as a desperate need for an operations officer by Lee, are most evident after the disappointing loss here in Glendale. Although the advance of Huger and Jackson had failed to materialize, he had sent no one to investigate or find out what was stalling the attacks. To be sure, Jackson himself did not report he was stuck in front of the White Oak Swamp. And again, neither did Lee send a courier back to find what was keeping the Valley Army. Jackson, upon getting rumblings that perhaps some of this had failure would rest on his shoulders, responded quite simply, General Lee had wanted me. He would have sent for me. Indeed, Lee's failure to communicate with Jackson, indeed the failure for there to be a cohesive communication between all of the elements of the Army, had cost the Confederacy mightily that day. The debate over Jackson's performance at White Oak Swamp often centers on what would have happened if Jackson had been able to force a crossing. However, it was not necessary for his men to physically cross White Oak Swamp merely to keep an impression to the Federals they were attempting to force a crossing. If the Federals had at any time sensed that Jackson was attempting to cross or making such movements, they certainly would not have dared to strip their lines in front of the swamp and send troops to the raging fight at Glendale. With Jackson's lack of activity and inertia that day allowed the Northern Army to send 4 brigades to shore up their sagging lines around the crossroads. These almost 12,000 men that were spared that day played a critical role in the ultimate repulse of Longstreet and A.T. Hill that evening. So as Robert E. Lee turned in that night, he certainly did, wondering how almost 60,000 men within 3 miles of the battlefield had failed to get involved in the fight. For 6 days, the armies had been in almost constant contact and battle with one another. The following day would bring day 7. Throughout the first 6 days of the campaign, Lee suffered through a string of battles in which his generally well-laid plans were destroyed by poor staff work and fumbled opportunities by his commanders. But on July 1st, with McClellan and the Army of the Potomac seemingly on the verge of escaping Lee's grasp, even Lee's usually tight planning and strategic genius would fall before the stress and strain of a week's worth of non-stop battle with the enemy. By sunrise on Tuesday, July 1st, 1862, the Army of the Potomac was just shy of their new base on Harrison's Landing. The wagons were well on their way to Berkeley Plantation. Portions of the Army were as well. The remainder would be forced to make a stand for one final day before retiring to the safe cover of Union gunboats along the James. And Lee almost undoubtedly recognized that this Tuesday was to be his final and last shot in the foe. And indeed, as the frustration of the previous 6 days mounted, it was Lee's normally meticulous planning that began to suffer. Jubal Early casually remarked to the commanding general that day that it appeared as if McClellan and his army might escape the clutches of the Army of Northern Virginia. At that point, Lee's frustration boiled over. He snapped at his fellow Virginian, He will escape because I cannot have my orders carried out. A remark possibly indicative that Lee held no hope for the day's coming pursuit. He may already have been considering McClellan's escape. And indeed, his actions that morning seemed more driven by the frustration and the desire to merely take one final swing at McClellan than to come up with a coordinated, well-thought-out battle plan. By the morning of July 1st, Lee was merely releasing his frustrations. He was no longer a strategist. He was a pugilist who wanted to draw blood from his opponent one more time before the final bell rang. There was to be no reconnaissance of the Federal position that morning. Plans were made merely from assumptions based on the notoriously bad map the Confederacy had and on general knowledge of the area. But one of the men in the Army who probably had a better general knowledge of the area than any other was the Reverend L.W. Allen. He was serving on the staff of General D.H. Hill. Allen had grown up in the area through which the Army was now passing, and that morning he described to Harvey Hill a strong position called Malvern Hill, which lay just ahead of the Confederate Army as they advanced that day. In meeting with Lee in Longstreet that morning, Hill passed along the warning that Allen had given him, adding his own caution that if General McClellan is there in force, we had better let him alone. Longstreet laughed off North Carolinians' concern, saying, "Don't get scared, now that we've got him whipped." Lee made no reply, and in his silence indicated to Hill an agreement with Longstreet. Indeed, there was much about Malvern Hill to give the Confederates pause. It was more a plateau than a hill. It was roughly 1.5 miles long, 3/4 of a mile wide, and 100 feet high at its crest. Additionally, the ground was made highly defensible by the presence of 2 streams that ran along the eastern and western sides of the hill. Turkey Run on the west and Western Run on the east. And along the northern rim of the plateau, the Union battle line was arrayed. Now, for the first time in the 7 days, McClellan had his entire army at his disposal. His position on Malvern Hill certainly reflected this strength. No less than 9 divisions of Union infantry were posted in a semicircular position around the heights. Along the front, they had the support of at least 8 batteries of artillery, while into the rear, the Federal Army's artillery reserve, almost 100 guns, was posted. Among that reserve artillery were 14 of the mammoth siege guns, which his men had so laboriously dragged up during the night. And finally, the Malvern Hill position was now within the protective cloak of Federal gunboats on the James River. In all, some 80,000 Federals were ready for battle, backed by almost 200 pieces of artillery. Lee's plans to press the Federal retreat that morning would rest again with the commands of Stonewall Jackson and Prince John Magruder, as it had done at Savage Station a few days earlier. Jackson was to lead the way, followed by Magruder, and ultimately by Huger as he came up. So patient was Lee, though, that in this tandem of Jackson and Magruder, he does not seem to have considered the probability of poor performance. Jackson had utterly failed to cooperate with Magruder at Savage Station. For that matter, he appeared unwilling or unable to cooperate with anyone up to this point in the campaign. But for Lee, only 2 reliable commanders to this point, Longstreet and A.P. Hill, were unavailable due to the high casualties they had taken the night before at Glendale. The possibility of McClellan making good his escape, Lee was forced to play this less than ideal game. However, as had long since become the standard operating procedure for the Army of Northern Virginia that week, these plans quickly went awry. This time, blame fell on the shoulders of John Magruder. Like so many others, Prince John was showing signs of fatigue that July 1st. In fact, so apparent was Magruder's malaise, and so concerned was his staff about it, they formed a deputation in the form of Major Joseph Brent to inquire after the general's well-being. Magruder replied, "Major, you are correct. I am feeling horribly. For 2 days, I have been disturbed in my digestion, and the doctor has given me medicine. I fear he has given me some morphine in this mixture. The smallest quantity of it acts upon me as an irritant. Besides that, I have lost so much sleep that it affects me strangely. But I fully appreciate your kindness in speaking to me, and I will endeavor to regain my self-control. And the effect that this lack of sleep and this tincture of morphine had on Magruder's demeanor caused many who encountered him that day to think he was drunk. Prince John's performance would only fuel those rumors. These plans for advance had called for Jackson to proceed along the Quaker or the Willis Church Road, to be followed by the division of Magruder to then Puget. Magruder had in his command 3 local boys who would be asked to serve as guides that morning. Magruder did not bother to consult the one map that Lee had, or even ask general directions for which way his command was to advance. Rather relied solely upon these 3 local guides. Unknown to him or to them, there were 2 Quaker roads in the area. The one chosen by his guides led him directly away from Malvern Hill. In his exhausted stupor, Magruder continued along this crude pathway, despite the fact that obviously no troops had preceded him down the route. Finally, Magruder was fished out of the Virginia countryside by James Longstreet, countermarched his men back towards the main Confederate battle line, and did not reach the position until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. While Magruder had been crisscrossing the Henrico County countryside, Lee and Longstreet had been scouting the Confederate left and right in an attempt to devise some sort of attack plan for that day. And it was Longstreet who would return with what Lee considered the best idea. Longstreet had found a small knoll to the west of the Willis Church Road that was roughly the same height as the Federal position, and about 1,200 yards away from the main Federal line. Old Pete advanced the idea that if they could mass 40 to 60 guns on this knoll, and if the Confederate left could bring to bear a similar number of pieces, this crossfire might achieve the effect of throwing the Federal line into some confusion, and with that the infantry could be sent forward to deliver the knockout blow. They agreed with this plan and had orders drafted to that effect. And the orders that emanated from Lee's headquarters that afternoon among some of the vaguest and most puzzling ever to be generated by a master tactician with prized precision as much as Lee did. As drafted by Lee's chief of staff, Colonel R.H. Chilton, the orders read, batteries have been established to rake the enemy's line. It is broken, as is probable. Brigadier General Lewis A. Armistead, who can witness the effect of the fire, has been ordered to charge with a yell. Do the same. Once again, Lee's orders and plans for the day directed merely by an desperate attempt to strike at McClellan before he got away. Though Lee had not drafted these orders, it is doubtful that he read over them, for certainly he would have recognized the problems. Unmilitary, confusing wording. The orders had no time of issue on them to be used as a reference point, and worse, these orders, control of the battle was being turned over to a general who that afternoon would be commanding a brigade for the first time on the field of battle. And this commander, Armistead, had the discretion for ordering 15 brigades of Confederate artillery forward, based only on the fact that he happened to be in a good position for observation. Certainly, Lee did not intend for this battle to be controlled by a mere brigadier, but neither did he draft clear orders himself, or possibly did he even read over the ones sent by Chilton. Regardless, upon the issuing of these orders, the command itself ceased upon the field. For these individual parts of the larger army, malfunctioning already as they were, these troops were now left without a single guiding hand to attempt to control them. For after giving the go-ahead for the attack, he took a position along the Willis Church Road behind Jackson. But before long, it became apparent that this plan simply would not succeed. The artillery barrage, which Lee had listed as probable, never got off the ground. Of the 80 or so guns that the plan had called for, 40 on the right, 40 on the left, perhaps no more than a score ever made it onto the field. Only 16 made it on the Confederate left, Jackson's front, and none came up from D.H. Hill. Hill's guns had been sent to Seven Pines for refitting. Oddly enough, on the day when they needed it most, no one could find the Confederate reserve artillery for the command of General William Nelson Pendleton. In fact, Hill would sum up the artillery's performance that day in trying to shell the Federals into submission. Hill would describe it as of a most farcical nature. And indeed, Lee himself soon abandoned his plans for the frontal assaults following this artillery barrage, and began to seek a position on the Confederate left by which the Union Army might be turned. Now, while in his own mind he had canceled this planned attack, he had neglected to send orders to his commanders that this plan had now been abandoned. So these lieutenants continued to operate under an outdated military strategy. Their commander in his own mind seems to know was doomed to fail. Between 3 and 4 o'clock that afternoon, the wagging command of John Bankhead Magruder finally arrived on the field. It was here that some coincidental timing committed the Army of Northern Virginia to a battle that certainly none of them, Robert E. Lee himself included, could have won. Armistead's men were coming under some fairly hot skirmishing fire from the Verdun sharpshooters that day. Sharpshooters behind shocks and wheat, playing Armistead's men in the pesky fire. Armistead's men, a few companies of them, simply to drive off these skirmishers and relieve this hot fire, drove into the field, drove the sharpshooters back, which they did, certainly, with a large cheer as they went out. Happening upon the field at that precise moment, none other than Magruder himself. As he arrived, some 3 hours or so late, he was handed this order, which read, "Armistead's men will charge with a yell, you do the same." There was no time on the order. Magruder could not have known that order had been issued some 3 hours earlier. Magruder looked up, saw Armistead's men in the field, heard the commotion, immediately sent word to Lee that the attack was underway. What should he do? Lee was very heartened by this report. He sent a messenger back to Magruder to press the advantage immediately. The problem for Magruder by afternoon was he had no troops. The commanding general had arrived on the field well in advance of his army. Here he had been ordered forward by his commander. Here he had the opportunity to redeem himself for the rebuke Lee had given him following Savage Station. So if Lee wanted him to attack, by gum, he was going to do just that. Grabbing the first 5,000 men he found, never mind they were Huger's men, not his own, he sent these 3 brigades into the field and attacked on the Federal position. The rear, D.H. Hill, who had long since given up on any plans for attack that day, heard the commotion himself. He ordered his own brigadiers into the field. And with that, Lee, again, as he had done throughout the previous week, made an assault on a strong Federal position, only part of his army, falling apart again due to poor communication and poor staff work. Until nightfall mercifully brought an end to the firing, the Confederates made desperate attempt after desperate attempt, never coming any closer than 75 yards from the Federal position. The Federals were just too strong. And with nightfall, mercifully for the Confederates, the fighting came to a close. At this point, Lee's frustration, not only for the events that day, but the events of the preceding week, boiled over completely. He sought out Magruder himself and demanded of Prince John why he had persisted in attacks against such long and hopeless odds. Magruder replied quite simply to his chief, "On your orders, twice delivered." Certainly, Lee had no response to that. Lee had certainly not intended for Magruder to go forward with such a half-hearted attempt. Lee's orders, twice delivered to Magruder, assumed that Armistead had indeed attacked in force, and not sent out some skirmishers to drive off the Verdun sharpshooters. Secondly, his orders, twice delivered, assumed that Magruder was in position, had full control of his troops, which he did not. And again, the conduct of an army on the field of battle ultimately comes back to its commander. We recognize that and made no attempt to shed that responsibility. He made no reply to Magruder that evening. Just walked off quietly to consider what might have been. Unknown to anyone at that time, 7 days' battles were now over. The Federals were well within the protective range of Federal gunboats. By the following morning, majority of the Federal Army would be safely on their way to their new base at Harrison's Landing. So in the examination of the 7 days as two distinct campaigns, we see certainly that Robert E. Lee achieved the utmost success in the first phase, and that is relieving the pressure against the Confederate capital. What about the second phase? Glendale and Malvern Hill certainly represented to Lee a crisis of missed opportunity caused by poor staff work, poor coordination among his generals, and poor communication altogether. More importantly at hand, the people of Richmond, the grateful people of Richmond, look not to these shortcomings, but to the great success that Lee had met. Just 1 week earlier, people had faced almost certain capture by the Federal Army, and now they saw a good 20 miles put between them and the Federal Army. Richmond once again could breathe a little more easily. And also, as we often read, the way that a man reacts to adversity is the true success of his genius. Robert E. Lee was one man who immediately recognized these shortcomings and set out to do something about them. In the past 7 days, his army had come up short in several phases. Before the next 7 days were up, Lee would already have made some startling changes among his commanders. John Magruder, Benjamin Huger, Theophilus Holmes, these are names that you will not hear in the Eastern Theater for much longer. And in fact, by July 3rd, Magruder is already on his way out west. Lee also reorganized his command at this point and weighted it with the men that he felt he could trust the most. And that man at this point was none other than James Longstreet. In the reorganization of the Army of Northern Virginia that followed, Longstreet was given the bulk of the troops that had been under Jay and Magruder and Holmes. The jury was still out, I think, on Stonewall Jackson as far as Lee was concerned. Jackson would retain basically his own Valley Army in the division of Richard Buell. And for right now, he would continue to allow Jackson to operate, more or less when recalled for, under an independent command. He watched carefully the erratic Jackson, or at least to this point, the erratic Jackson. So in the 7 days, we see Robert E. Lee at his highest and at his lowest among his campaign in the Civil War. But to be certain, by the time all was said and done, Lee was showing already he possessed the skill and the talent to bring the Army of Northern Virginia to the forefront of the military units of the Confederacy. Thank you very much for your attention. If there are any questions, I would be more than happy to field them at this time. We're running up on lunch here. We'll take a few.
Lee sent the three you mentioned to the Trans-Mississippi, yet he kept the Minister Pendleton in charge of artillery, where he messed it up with the reserves. He did the same thing at Gettysburg. What strange fascination kept him with Pendleton all through this?
I can't even begin to speak for what it was that Lee saw or might have potentially might have seen. But you are right. There are almost immediately rumblings throughout the Army as to the failure of Pendleton that day. Pendleton had scores, nearly 100 guns at his disposal. And again, Lee had not sent for him. He had not ordered the guns up. But again, McClellan ordered up the reserve artillery of Henry J. Hunt to the rear of Malvern Hill. And Pendleton certainly was not showing a man to take any initiative at that point or try and take matters into his own hands. But I do not know what reasoning, if there was any, that Lee held on to Pendleton.
Didn't they eventually put Pendleton out to pasture without firing him, and put
They
Fort
give
Alexander?
him a new title, essentially, and bring in Porter Alexander to take over much more of the day-to-day, the handling of the artillery. So he is, you're right, phased out to
Was it politically sensitive not to just fire him or send him to Arkansas or something?
I don't know, and I can't say I know enough about Pendleton as to whether there might be some links that he had between government officials. Certainly, Lee was not a man bashful of getting rid of commanders who he saw that had failed him. And, yeah, I don't know what the politics involved with Pendleton there.
What was the Butchersville there at Malvern?
Oh, I'm sorry. I gave it to you, Glendale. By the time the fighting had ended, there were roughly 5,000 Confederate casualties in their assaults that day, and about 60% of that for the federal defenders, almost 3,000 casualties. So certainly the casualties on the Union side indicate that the Confederates had made a number of desperate attempts. In the end, the bill coming due for both armies, almost 20,000 casualties for the Confederate forces in a week's worth of fighting. 20,000 men that I believe would certainly have a difficult time replacing, especially as the summer and fall of 1862 go along. And for the Federals, between 14 and 15,000 in their defense and their retreat back to the river.
What was the mileage covered, say, from Mechanicsville all the way down to Malvern Hill?
Oh, an idea on what the total mileage is. You can add it up from one place to the other, 15, 20 miles.
Full harbor and march to Malvern Hill.
Did it?
Oh, you just
Yeah, the March for
Yeah,
Preservation just
that's
did that, and it was 19 and a half
count the
miles.
blisters on Mark's.
Well, I didn't do it this year, but other guys did.
Who was the general that said, this is not war, it's murder?
D.H. Hill, in summing up Malvern Hill. Hill writes with an acerbic tongue, and that's one of the many good accounts we have writing that it was not war, it was murder.
What happened to Hill? Anyway, D.H. Hill, you don't hear too much
Don't hear too much about him.
He seemed to perform very well early, I thought, in the engagement at 7 times.
His performance had certainly not been as bad as Huger or Magruder, and Hill will be sent to North Carolina. Yeah, Hill wound up shortly thereafter. Yeah, by the time the armies clash again at Second Manassas, just 2 months later, Hill has already been sent on.
I was trying to remember Alexander. If I remember, one Hill, D.H. Hill, with Jackson, and at Gaines Mill had moved up on the Confederate left flank and starting the action to fill in that flank, and Jackson pulled him back at Gaines Mill a couple of days before. So Jackson pulled him back, and it looked like Jackson was waiting for him, like he was in a duck blind, waiting for everybody to drive the Federals by him. And Hill had a handle on what was going on, and Jackson didn't.
Yeah, Hill's, again, it's Hill's skirmish troops, of course, the crossing of White Oak Swamp. It's Hill who comes up in the face of overwhelming odds, certainly recognizing that the division was going to be slaughtered at Malvern Hill. In accordance with his order, despite his own personal misgivings, sent his men forth. Yeah, a great deal of Hill in this campaign.
You think Hill was at Sharpsburg, and then subsequently was sent. I think he was blamed for the loss of those orders by Lee, and that's.
He kept his mouth shut, he did a good job.
Again, he had an acerbic tongue. What's his second Manassas?
I'm sure he was the second.
He was, yeah, I was going to say, he wasn't at Second Manassas. I don't know where
He was at Sharpsburg.
Yeah.
He lost the 2 front legs of his horse.
McClellan had any dialogue at all with his commanders on the field during the battle?
McClellan at Glendale was there early in the morning to oversee the placement of troops, and then rode off back down the James River, and not even appointing commanders, he left, so by de facto leaving it to Porter. And the following day at Malvern Hill, again, there's no communication from the general as the fight goes on. In fact, in McClellan's 64 run for the presidency, some of the political cartoons designed to bring him down were of the gunboat commander. There's one that McClellan's sitting on the back of binoculars, cheering his men on as they're slaughtered on the slopes of Malvern Hill. Yeah, he had turned over any sort of battlefield command throughout the entire war.
Did we use a system of couriers to apprise himself of where his people were, as Grant did in the 64 campaign?
Apparently not at this point. There was no communication between Lee and Jackson, Lee and Huger during the failings at Glendale. Lee himself personally rode down to spur Holmes on and get him underway. Again, the following day, there was not a good deal of open communication between the commanders. And I feel this is one of the big lessons that he does learn here, the necessity of keeping open communication. Again, just prior to Second Manassas, 2 months later, he sends Jackson off on the flanking march. And he is remarkably, despite this absence of 2 days march, this 50-some miles or so, he's in constant communication with Jackson through a series of just continual couriers riding back.
So this is kind of the dividing, the learning experience in that keeping contact with the command.
He does a much better job of it in his next campaign, sir.
Did the British Army, I got the impression on this thing of the couriers, they called them gallopers, you know, that would attach, they had clouds of them attached to their staff, didn't they? What I was thinking about is how much did our people learn from the British or just learn from the mistakes?
I certainly couldn't theorize on that. That's something I can't say I've delved a whole lot into. Certainly something that you would assume that we're.
I know some of the generals would get, some of the generals get criticized for having so many people attached to headquarters staff. But this thing shows what they were all for, really. That it took a hell of a lot of people.
Yeah, planning, you can plan the best campaign in the world, but things are always certainly not going to go as you have planned, and that is when it's imperative that you've got good staff work, an operations officer to oversee everything, you can encourage your staff to alert your men to the changes. I mean, that's certainly, yeah, an important lesson learned by the year. Back for
Penn State play tomorrow.
Penn State plays Michigan. I am taking a day off of work just so I can watch that.
That's an important question
That is the most important question to keep across.